I'm going to ask you to look at and listen to something with which many of you will be entirely familiar. But I want you to look at it and listen to it without grinning, smiling, or laughing. And then to tell me whether it's funny or not.
He knew exactly what was going to happen. He tried to step over the stumps and just flicked a bail with his right
He more or
hand.
less tried to do the splits over it, and unfortunately the inner part of his thigh must have just removed the bail.
He just didn't quite get his leg over.
Anyhow, he did very well indeed, batting 131 minutes and hit 3 fours. And then we had Lewis playing extremely well for his 47 not out. Agus, do stop it. And he was joined by De Freitas, who was in for 40 minutes, a useful little partnership there. They put on 35 in 40 minutes, and then he was caught by Dujean Forge. Lawrence, always entertaining, batted for 35. 35 minutes, hit a 4 over the wicketkeepers. Agus, for goodness sake, stop it.
Yes, Lawrence played extremely well.
He hit a 4 over the wicketkeeper's head, and he was out from behind. Tuftle came, batted for 12 minutes, and then was caught by Haynes off Patson.
For those of you who may not know it or have picked it, I saw one or two of you grinning. None of that, please. The whole point of this was, that if you didn't pick it up, that the commentator uses the word leg over. Once the nickname for a very senior judge in this country, but never mind. And as a result of that single use of the word, on a sustained period of commentary, and making all allowance for John's wonderful timing and the expectation of humour from the commentary box, they fall about laughing. But is there anything funny in it? Can anybody explain to me why that is funny? Yes, sir.
One suspects that Ian Bertham had a reputation for getting his leg over.
He may have done, but I'm not sure that that's what was funny. I think it was just the use of the word. I might be wrong.
Would it be more significant, or did he find it those who think it's funny?
I'm sure many people did. They were grinning. They couldn't stop themselves. The short answer, let me try and race there. Yes, Andrew.
Well, I think it's the fact that they lost control. That's what became funny. The remark itself is clearly they lost control. Engaged us all.
Is it that, or is it that simply no one can talk about sex seriously? And once you allow a word about sex into an otherwise normal conversation, your behaviour changes. Think about the same thing translated, it's hard to do, but I managed it, to a similar word slip with a non-sexual connotation. A chap who's worked on Crossrail for many years finds himself commentating on a tennis match and refers not to a cross-court forehand, but to a cross-rail forehand. You wouldn't laugh. It's not remotely funny. It's just a slip of the tongue. And if you go to cinema, if you go to the theatre these days, and any day, any use of a sexual word, or a swear word, but a sexual word, brings out guffaws from the live audience to such an extent that you can, and I recently did, entirely lose the plot of the play. I couldn't hear it over the ridiculous laugh simply at the use of particular words. And funnily enough, it doesn't happen so much in films where you can have graphically displayed sex and the strongest language and people sit there in absolute and well-behaved silence. Possibly because, and it's just a guess, there is something of a conversation or a threatened conversation in what happens with a live performance that puts the audience ill at ease, that they may have to engage in a conversation that has had this unfortunate element in it. So humour shows us that we can't talk about sex seriously. It also, by the way, mentioning the programme Round the Horn, should remind us that humour has been very important over the last 50 or 60 years in developing our society's culture and in moving things forward. But we don't perhaps have time to go into that too much. Now, sex has a great deal to do with fantasy, or the other way around. So let me tell you about a fantasy that I've had. Let us imagine at the dispatch box a minister or cabinet minister, or even higher, narrating to the assembled Right Honourable and other members his last night's experience, explaining in graphic terms how he had the vision of the use of force, and the subjection to force, the pleasure that it caused and generated. And then saying to the House, as I had these thoughts last night, I was, of course, busily engaged, I nevertheless thought, members and Right Honourable members, of how you would sympathise with me, for at least 50% of you have had the same imagination in the course of your lives, maybe last night. And it is for that reason, ladies and gentlemen, the minister or cabinet minister might say, that you will be supporting me today in this bill to introduce into the drinking water of this country the drug fluorosexide, which will, at a stroke, restrain us forever from passing from that narrow band of permissible, enjoyable, and proper sexual fantasy beyond the line into the territory of action that is entirely impermissible. Well, of course, no such minister would ever say such things for a number of reasons, and if the drug even existed that could restrain us from popping over from fantasy to reality, it would never be introduced into the drinking water. But it's worth understanding that such things, and of course fantasies of that kind, we know are more or less a majority contemplation. So that the business of stopping yourself stepping over the line is a real issue, but no one can ever speak about it. You can consider that fantasy, ludicrous though it is, with another one which will make the point, perhaps, and that is that slightly more realistically, a minister could stand up in the House in the appropriate circumstances and say, I am confident that every member of the House, like me, will never have contemplated taking firearms and, as a group, mounting an attack, an armed attack on banks. None of us will ever have thought of that. And for that reason, members and Right Honourable members will be happy to quadruple the sentencing for armed robbery. And of course, he could say that because it would be true, and the mental state to which she or he would be referring would be a genuine one that everyone can adopt. But in matters of sex, it's much, much more difficult. They can't talk about sex because they may well harbour suspicions about their own pasts, about whether they have crossed that line between permitted and unpermitted activity that they have to condemn in the strongest terms in others. They may also be inhibited because of what they know or strongly believe about the real behaviour of friends or of colleagues. And memory itself is degraded by the passage of time and the change of public morality. I well recall a friend of ours, many years ago now, who worked for a time on Jim'll Fix It, and who observed casually how Saville had been looking at a clearly underage girl and saying, something about Mr. Policeman, clearly explaining that he had unlawful activity in mind and being prepared to discuss it with somebody who was a comparatively minor work colleague. But our friend, quite genuinely, I'm sure, no longer has that memory. It wasn't important then. These things disappear according to the social morality of the day in which we live, not the next generation or the one before. And last year I was surprised to turn up a letter written in 1965 to me by a school teacher, schoolmaster at a grammar school, who ran a music or drama group for school leavers and people just in or just out of university. He was, I guess, about 40, and he wrote of returning to school to work from another academic post, observing that teaching was driving him mad, but, and I quote precisely what he said, he was cultivating two gorgeous third formers, usual trick, let them do the seducing, then wham. Now there are four extraordinary things about this letter. First, that if his bragging was accurate, he was a schoolmaster who'd been engaging in unlawful sex or similar. Second, that he felt emboldened to write to somebody he did not know very well, 20 years his junior, writing what would nowadays be the end of career and maybe the passport to prison. But the third and fourth most extraordinary things for me when I came across this letter was that I didn't react at the time at all, and that I'd completely forgotten about it. Those were, and we have to recognize the degree to which they were, those were very different times. I felt compelled, having worked out who it was, to look up on the internet to see if his name featured and to wonder what I'd have to do, if anything, about a man who would inevitably now be 90. Mercifully, I was freed of having to make that decision. And finally, beyond moving from things that you'll think I'm just saying to entertain you, but I'm not, they all come with something of a purpose. Another fantasy I've often had is about a headmaster at an induction hearing with schoolboys and their parents, explaining that what used to be called self-abuse is something best conducted at home just as the staff do. Again, it being a majority pursuit, something not known to schoolboys who, if of a nervous disposition, used to travel with a fold-up white stick in their satchels for fear of something horrid happening to them as a result of what they'd been doing. People cannot talk about sex, but you're doing quite well at listening about it. My school, I have to say, seemed remarkably untroubled by the problems of some schools. Masters suspected of being what is now called gay were not known ever to have acted improperly and were respected for their devotion to teaching. But once I got to university, I got to know boys from boarding public schools and heard accounts of what teachers assumed to be their rights in respect of the boys, quite beyond my understanding. And also beyond my understanding that not only didn't the boys object, but the parents didn't object either. And sexual abuse, of which one grew to hear, was part of an overall range of abuse conducted against boys, with physical abuse at one end. And only recently, a very thoroughly nice bloke I know, of my age now, gave an account to me of the clear sadistic relish of his headmaster at a famous boarding school, whose beatings were apparently to be endured without any hint that his parents would be even interested, let alone that they might complain, or that his health, or that his mental health might have been affected. And I sat wide-eyed as I listened, wondering whether I would have had anything like the sang-froid he appeared to have, and I'll return to his account in dealing with what was taken for granted. Now, our discussion tonight might be, or might benefit from consideration of sexual behavior in Greek, Roman, Elizabethan and Victorian times, but overall it's sufficient, I think, to deal with the last 6 or so decades, and to note that since the 60s, because people simply cannot and will not say publicly much or anything about what happens in private, then morality itself changes, and to a degree, a substantial degree, It changes unobserved, under the surface. And this can be risky for the unwary, the doers, or to those to whom bad things are done. And we've seen much of that in the last few years, as we will consider. But first, let me give you a little survey arising from my own professional career that happened to have me in cases giving me a view of how things were developing, at least as I now understand it. First, in the 1970s, I prosecuted a few prostitute cases and learnt about the warrens of rooms in Soho where prostitutes, with the security of a maid, would receive their clients. Periodically, the scurrying figure of the man who took the excessive rents to the real owner of the property, who would stay away, unless, of course, he happened to prefer to sit in the cupboard looking out through the spy hole, or turning up to deliver violence, sometimes even said to be fatal, to the prostitutes who didn't pay. The determination of the police to prosecute these men made some sense, as they profited so excessively from the risky and to me unappealing activities, but I could see more to prostitution than vice. Much later, a relation left me some very honest and revealing tapes about the approach of respectable but not privileged men, such as my relation was, in the interwar years, and who, coming from the blue-collar band of society, treated women who were going to be their romantic interests in a restrained and, as they would have thought, very respectful way. And so, for them, prostitutes were entitled to much higher level, perhaps, of respect than had happened by the 1970s. By the 1970s, the revolution of standards was well underway. Let me tell you that in the 60s, an ex-Russian princess teaching her language to the sixth formers of South London, where I was, boulderized Macmillan, saying it wasn't so much a matter of you've never had it so good as you've never had it so often. And we all fell about wondering what sort of exciting world we were entering. But that was the 60s. Things were changing. And of course, I think we've got a picture here just to remind you, for those of Mandy Rice-Davies and Christine Keeler, and you'll vaguely recall the appalling way in which Stephen Ward was dealt with on one level of societal condemnation, while underneath it and all around, society was loosening up and behaving in a thoroughly free and it may be pretty immoral way. But so far as prostitutes were concerned, by the 1970s, the expectation was, of course, that if you wanted sex, you would be able to have it for free. And that's another reason why prostitutes maybe were lower in the esteem of society than in truth they could have been if people were honest about the way they approached these things. So that was one sort of undercurrent of change of which I was dimly aware, and I then found myself prosecuting dirty books. And how dirty they were. They were unreadable, often violent, and one must be prepared to be straightforward. I'll give you one example. They frequently narrated so-called stories of the clenched fist going into places where it was never intended to go. I could barely understand how what I was reading could be of any appeal, let alone how any act could be of any pleasure to anyone. Before I turn to the trials of these books, the internet has now enabled me to ask and answer a question that occurred to me back then in the 1980s. Was this extraordinary practice something of long standing? Not at all, says the internet. And by the way, my internet has been riddled with so many queries leading up to this lecture that if the police don't call, I will be bombarded for years with unwelcome websites offering services and things that I have no interest in responding to. But never mind. Back to the extraordinary and unnatural practice. No, said the internet. Entirely a 20th century invention. Not Los Angeles, San Francisco. Let's just think about that. This entirely 20th century practice, as alien to cavemen and people until the 19th century as many of the other things described in these horrifying books. A damaging, non-productive act, surely it was corrupting. Surely. How could it be anything else? One weekend, I took these books, which I found impossible to read home, to try and work out which bits to present to the jury the following week. And somebody, a very respectable woman, asked me what cases I was doing. When I told her I shouldn't have done, but I allowed her to scan them. And she still found them intriguing, ghastly though they were. What was I to make of that? Did these books show something about the vulnerability of humans to persuasion to enter the dark world of progressive, degraded imagination? Or do I sound like Mary Whitehouse? And again, for those of you who don't know her, Mary Whitehouse was a famous, very public, very conservative moralist who opposed all these things and many other developments and changes alike, and she was trashed by the developing liberal class, such as myself. I really couldn't believe these books. And there are two horrible things I've heard recently to tell us what's actually happening in our society. I remember last year a doctor talking on the radio about having to treat teenage girls for the consequences of their having consented to buggery by their boyfriends, the effect that had on their anatomies. And he made a comment, which you'll find resonates in my last part of this lecture. He made a comment which in the 1970s would have been regarded as out of the arc. He said, surely they'd be better off playing tennis. And he was right, wasn't he? Absolutely right. And indeed, by chance, because I didn't really believe these things, but by chance, a reconstructive surgeon, I was talking to you about something else not so very long ago, let out as an aside that he and his team had to extract from unexpected places Coca-Cola bottles and the like on which the unfortunate host had sat by mistake. Well, really. But that is what we are dealing with. I found it almost impossible to read these hideous books. And at their trials, however, I had the good fortune of often facing, for the defense, the famous QC John Mortimer, and author of the very human and humane Rumpole of the Bailey. And he'd turn up, and often enough he'd want his clients to plead guilty. He'd approach the judge in private, and the judge, terrified, well, yes, Mr. Mortimer, no, Mr. Mortimer, yes, Mr. Mortimer. Well, I agree, Mr. Mortimer, only very slightly corrupting, and yes, of course, your client can have a suspended sentence. Thank you very much, and that would happen. Occasionally, he had to fight the cases, contest them for some reason or another, and so he made it clear that he never read the books, which he always held upside down if he touched them at all. And addressing them, as you remember, his glasses used to be a bit like that. He'd give them his usual and famous freedom of speech address that always knocked for six these extraordinary passages in the book that it seemed to me were inevitably corrupting, and I always lost. Perhaps the jury was simply unable to discuss the realities of the terrible activities portrayed and accepted from Mr. Mortimer that freedom of speech meant freedom to write almost anything. Perhaps they thought that Mrs. Mary Whitehouse was a busybody, and that by voting for an acquittal, they were in some way rejecting the limited forces of conservatism that were battling sexual liberalization of all kinds. However, on one of these trials, that very nice chap I told you about, who told me about his terrible beatings at a famous public school, he was defending. And he addressed the jury saying that surely these books were a little different from what one would expect to find in one's son's tuck box at school. I'm afraid he lost, but this may, of course, have been the case of class prejudicing freedom of speech, Or it may be that the jury just didn't want their future leaders to be corrupted by material of this kind placed into their tuck boxes. Dirty books, of course, are part of the much broader range of material known as pornography, soft or hard, that has its attackers and defenders. It cannot be said that it necessarily and overall causes people to commit offences of sexual violence. Some argue on the basis of statistics that it can have the opposite effect. But the books, as I was prosecuting them, were part of this extreme burgeoning of pornography. And the people we are now considering who have been prosecuted for historic sex cases were committing the offences that they are now known to have committed against, amongst other things, the rapid rise in tolerance of material to such an extent that now available statistics about the viewing of pornography and about its availability to children are, to those who fear it is harming us, truly alarming. But it is, so we understand, a majority interest. The only, perhaps, ray of hope is that Playboy has given up its centerfold recently. What comes next and why they've done that, I'm not sure. And so I eventually, or rather soon, I'm happy to say, got out of dirty books and had a few cases in the 1990 and 91 or thereabouts of child abuse. Well, that's, of course, abuse of, in the cases I was dealing with, to which I'll come, mostly really very young children. But it's part, abuse of children, is part of what, or it's allied to what has been the subject of the inquiries at the BBC. And conveniently, again, for the timing of my lectures, you'll probably recall that Dame Janet Smith's report into Jimmy Savile came out last week. And I haven't read all of it, but I've read, amongst other things, chapter 3, which is the general background. And so, whereas what I'm telling you is a bit anecdotal, she's much more researched, and it's a very, very worthwhile chapter to read. It's on the internet. And there's Mary Whitehouse, by the way, for those of you who want to remember her, and those of you who didn't know, that's what she looked like. But Dame Janet Smith's report explains that which we may have not known or forgotten, that since Victorian times, British society has recognised the need to protect children from sexual abuse, although only recently that it appreciated how much protection is needed. And she goes on to explain that the single unifying term child abuse encompassed all maltreatment, and when the term abuse began commonly to be used in the 70s, it was used primarily to refer to the physical assaults on children, and it became encompassing in the 1980s, where the problem of child sex abuse became more widely recognised. So that it's so easy to forget, both from the time looking forward, my friend who worked at Jimmy Savile, and looking back, how recent our understanding of these things is and are. She sets out, and it's in the paper handout, some of the statutory provisions that have helped protect children, or aimed to protect children, since the 19th century. But I'll come back to that one in a minute. We'll go back to that in a second rather than distract you. But before I come to the next part from her report that I want to refer you to, I'll tell you a couple of things about the cases I prosecuted in 1990 and 1991. They were, by those standards, quite large cases, although now I think they'd be regarded as pretty small. They included the famous or the infamous phrases paedophile rings, and the cases were subject to many technicalities of proof that led to many acquittals, far more then than now, when the pendulum has completely swung, and I think it's much easier, probably, to get convictions in child cases, although I have dealt with none myself for 2 decades. But what was most obvious to me about these crimes is that they were committed by people with very limited chances in life, with very limited education, and some of them probably with actually limited intelligence, who lived in unsatisfactory accommodation, who were unlikely to have a great deal to do with their lives outside work, even assuming they had any work. And in most or all cases, there was indication or even hard evidence that the abusers had themselves been abused. And I wondered at the time, how can we deal with that? And does sending people to prison deal with it at all? And the fundamental question for that type of offender was, at what stage does a person of limited ability have to be punished for things done that maybe he simply can't resist? And what a terrible waste of life, any life, the life of the abuser, much more the person abused. What a terrible waste of life for this activity to happen at all. Well, although that was my particular experience of the type of person, we also have to acknowledge, if it be that there is any reality behind the many police inquiries that are underway, that abusing children is not just a one-class activity. It covers all classes, including people of intelligence. But the same question arises, not just how do we send them to prison, which we can now do, and we can do for historic cases, but how on earth as a society can we stop people crossing that line, even if they have to be allowed for some reason the fantasy of this extraordinary activity, they have to be stopped from crossing the line into the reality, preferably wipe out the fantasy too. And I suppose all this does bring us back to Jimmy Savile. With some celebrities, it is possible, we understand, to feel respect and to feel envy for them and for their position, even for those Hollywood stars who announce famously that they're addicted to sex. They probably do have men saying, "Phew, if only it was me." But they shouldn't, although you can be sure they do. Because what they're looking at in the smiling face of a Hollywood star who regrets his addiction, what they're looking at as an idol is a man whose own personal idolatry was the genre of beautiful women available to him. But Savile also smiled and looked content. Was he? Was he internally excited by what he achieved, given that he famously disliked children, so it is said? Or was his a horrible body to inhibit, and was it one that may itself have been constructed by abuse perpetrated on him? One thing is now clear: he had, or he developed, an appetite that society's structures did little or nothing to restrain. And this is what Dame Janet said, not in her opening statement to the press. Most of all, she said, in the 1970s, 80s and 90s, child protection was very low on the BBC's radar. In this, the BBC was far from alone. At that time, our society did not recognize the prevalence of sexual abuse of children. Complaints were disbelieved and therefore rarely made. We were not sufficiently shocked by the signs of older men being sexually involved with teenage girls, and we were unaware of the damage which such unequal relations could cause. Sexual harassment was not taken seriously. And these things were all happening, it now seems to me, just when the strongest undercurrent in society was working against any control in an environment where even to criticize relaxation of sexual controls might attract a reputation of being old-fashioned, repressive, illiberal, or worse. And there was, of course, very good reason for much of the liberation that was happening. The long process of an individual's sexuality being publicly accepted and something that would no longer prejudice her or him was in train, and clearly, at least according to nearly all European standards, something that needed encouraging. So it was always likely to be difficult to be permissive and encouraging of some acts recently regarded as criminal being liberalized and accepted by many in society on the one hand, yet trying to tie down permissive acts on the other. And so it was, I think, that people were doing things in lax environments where there was probably much misplaced admiration for the liberties some men took by other, more timid friends and colleagues. The doers thought they would get away with what they did. They probably often thought it was not even something they needed getting away with. They thought they could be as immune as rock stars, it would appear, still appear to be. But they overlooked that the liberal public morality they thought would protect them was never publicly stated, because it could not be, and could be denied when the reality of harm done to the objects of their interest became known. Once that started to happen, the line dividing fantasy from acceptable reality was ebbing and flowing against them. They should have left as fantasy what they put into effect, but it was too late. Dame Janet's report contains, in chapter 3, some very interesting examples. I've got 3 here that encapsulate and capture probably the atmosphere of the time. A journalist told me while working at the BBC he'd seen a crowd of young girls standing in the corridor waiting to get into the Top of Pop studios. He said it was hard to tell their ages as they were made up to the nines, but from the conversations he heard, he had the impression they were there in the hope of bedding the presenter. What had this freeing morality done to our children? Paragraph 3.65. Tina Ritchie, who in the early 90s worked as a newsreader on BBC Radio 1, described hearing of a lot of sort of bottom slapping of women in the office at Egdon House, which contrasted with her experience in current affairs. She attributed the contrast to those incredibly famous men surrounded by people who did exactly what they wanted because they were incredibly famous. It's the sort of one feeding the other and everybody surviving slightly on a culture of fear, because one word from a presenter and you would be in trouble, which is why I didn't say anything. And finally, one witness who worked on Radio 1 said there were lots of wandering hands and comments about your body. Chaps just felt it was perfectly fine to put their hand on your bum and other places. Others who also worked in Radio 1 described how a colleague would put his hands up the front of her jumper while she was working, and when she complained, the reaction was to ask if she was a lesbian. In the witness's view, it didn't come from the top. It was supported and endorsed and allowed to continue from the top. This isn't that long ago, and this is your society. Many of you, the society for which you voted for MPs and governments. You voted in other ways by your support of television programs, films, and so on, which I did too. But I've already announced that I was a reckless, excessive, anti-White House liberal. We'll return to her too. These very general considerations may set the scene sufficiently for me to ask the questions that arise from the title of this lecture, but there's something else that we might want to have in mind. The culture and the recent-ish cases that bring the culture into consideration is largely one of, and for part only of, our present society. It's a part that the minister relating his fantasy could readily understand, not the least because of common education and common youthful experience. But in our multi-ethnic, multinational society, there are many groupings, some of which have cultures that seem to treat women with much greater distance and possibly much greater respect. But do they? Do we actually know anything about the reality of the private lives of other cultures? Perhaps not. In this country, this sort of Gresham audience, interested in public affairs and in some ways inevitably liberal in disposition, will be getting better day by day at dealing with covered women, or to those who decline any physical contact with men except their husbands, not even a handshake. We may even get to know and not be disturbed by extreme sects where men avoid all contact with women, to the extent, as a recent New York Times article revealed, of having women moved in planes when they are seated by the airline next to an unknown and unrelated man, a member of the sex. We read of societies of men abroad who are deprived of the company of women altogether until a dowry is raised and paid, and of the effect that will have on the sexual lives of those men with men. And we can know that those communities may well find themselves represented in our society before very long, if they're not here already. And in all these cases, we know probably absolutely nothing of what happens in private, locked away from us by double doors of privacy and secrecy. It's hard enough for us to deal with our present problems derived from public and private morality and immorality familiar to this general population. But, and we know that our own history of this part of our culture is full of hypocrisy. Oscar Wilde condemned publicly while the upper class was behaving pretty broadly in the way that he did without condemnation. We know all those things, but we will have to face the fact that other societies or parts of societies, when they're with us, will have their own conundrums to face and to unravel if universal standards are to be applied, as all our present public thinking would appear to demand. I have no difficulty overall in thinking that men, and very occasionally women, who do these things are wicked, even if they are only repeating in adult life what they experienced as children. But as one of a number of really unappealing questions to be asked for you to consider and answer in the modern age, this: is it possible that in particular environments, victims, like my friend of physical violence at the famous public school, are not affected in the way he claims he was not affected by physical violent abuse? Is it possible that another friend, the one I told you about, who was sexually assaulted by the headmaster of his famous public school on the very last day he was at school, as the ultimate act of teacher control, is it possible that he's not affected? I'm not actually sure that he claims not to have been. But should we hope for people who've been part of this part of our culture that they are not affected because it will mean they have not suffered? Or should we hope to identify and to articulate suffering, even suffering of which they may barely be aware, so that we can be more condemning and seek more punishment for the people who abused children however long ago? And allied to that is this, in today's climate, almost unaskable question. But it comes from exchanges I've had with women friends of my sort of age, as they hear or read about the lesser sexual offences, lesser in gravity, charged against people who go off to prison for significant periods of time, their lives turned round. And often exasperated, those women say, or they remark, that they should not have been such a to-do made about something that they would have dealt with by a slap round the face or similar, and that they would not conceivably have been as changed as victims in the way, or as the girl victims now claim to have been. I must ask the question neutrally, and I'm happy to do it. Are these women expressing this view, suppressing the reality of what happened to them in slap-face incidents? Or were they in fact damaged, but unable to acknowledge as much? Can we progress? Throughout the time I've had occasionally to think about these things, I have been quite unaware of any active steps by governments to change our private or public morality, save to the extent the law and criminal cases may deter, but all too late, because by then the victims have been damaged, and come to that, the perpetrators too. Access to pornography barely regulated. Limitations on what can be shown on TV and the screen all abandoned with the enthusiastic support of liberal-minded people like me. Scornful contempt for the wretched Mary Whitehouse, for those who remember her. Or was she quite so wretched after all? Her nemesis at the bar was Jeremy Hutchinson QC, now Lord Hutchinson, 100 years old last year. He defended Christine Keeler. He also defended George Blake, the spy, Charlie Wilson, the train robber, and his professional life covered the very period of our present concern, and he was always on the liberal wing of the society to which he was born personally privileged. He successfully defended Penguin Books on charges of obscenity when they published Lady Chatterley's Lover, and did similar work for the film The Last Tango in Paris, and for the play The Romans in Britain, each of which, incidentally, damaged the women performers, actresses involved. Now, Charles Moore of the Daily Telegraph is an unlikely choice of commentator for me to favour. But he wrote a congratulatory piece about Lord Hutchinson's 100th birthday that showed how sometimes great age can take someone into a world they might never have expected to enter, and in Lord Hutchinson's case, into the world where Mary Whitehouse might be better regarded than she was after she lost so many trials against liberals he represented. Charles Moore's survey, which I've set out pretty well in full in the note, differs in its viewpoint from mine or from Dame Janet Smith's. It's worth reading in full, but I'm going to give you a couple of, or a bit more than a couple, a few selections of the things he said. He's, of course, a man, again, of our sort of age, my sort of age, and he surveys things from a very conservative point of view. And he says this: the Hutchinsons of the legal world fought for the quality of mercy and mostly prevailed. It's shocking to think how readily books and films could be banned, but partly because of technological change and greater tolerance, it's unlikely that a free country would now suppress a book by law. 1 point. Second, more generally, he says, I doubt whether art has been improved by feeling free to swear its head off. He's referring to the endless four-letter words on screen television and in plays. The fact that certain words were taboo, he volunteers, gave them potency and added to humour. The idea that everything has to be full frontal is an anti-artistic one. Then he deals with how Shakespeare managed pretty well without showing the act itself on stage, but said both Last Tango in Paris and The Romans in Britain were prosecuted because they included explicit scenes of anal sex, rape in the latter case. I do not think it was a good idea to try to ban them, nor was it a good idea artistically to put them on. He says campaigners like Mary Whitehouse were laughed at for complaining about a tide of filth. It doesn't seem an accurate, but it does not seem an inaccurate description of what resulted. They were also considered ludicrous for asking, is nothing sacred? Yet it is a good question for society to ask itself, because if the answer is no, you can be certain that life will become more barbaric. He observed that it's welcome that children nowadays have sex education, but is it welcome that they learn about sex roles from pornography on the internet? The amount of material pushing very young girls to make their bodies more sexually attractive is not a symptom of liberation, but of imprisonment. And then he turns to the Jimmy Savile, the classic case of how the 60s concept of fun acted as a cover for something much darker. Mrs. Whitehouse's warning about the exploitation of women in the brave new liberated world was seen as fuddy-duddy at the time. But note the next sentence. They now seem almost fashionably feminist as we learn more about how powerful men were able to exploit the breaking down of boundaries. The Mary Whitehouses lost the argument. Perhaps they deserve to do so because their only solution to the problems they identified was try to ban whatever they didn't like. But they did have a sense that civilization is fragile and that things which are low and disgusting make it more so. And that allows me to bring to a conclusion with a little less time for questions than I'd hoped, but some. I'm not sure even now, if Mary Whitehouse were around, that I would support her. But I can be quite sure that those caught up and punished heavily for what they did decades ago might wish she had had more sway and have been of more effect. The Stuart Halls and the Rolf Harrises of this world are unlikely to think that the short-term pleasure of those years long gone was worth the long-term suffering and complete disgrace by which their lives will end. They would probably say, even Savile might have said, it would have been better for there to be a moral compass so set that they would be encouraged at best or worst in such a way that fantasy should have stayed as fantasy, because they could have succeeded in public life with all its trappings without abusing their positions. But there were, they might say, simply no restraints operating on them. But there is nothing we can put in the drinking water to control us. Ultimately, it is our society that must do what it can to bring under control behavior derived from the animal need to reproduce, and not to allow that impulse to be extended for commercial reasons, or indeed by reason of fashion, incrementally to behavior that has no place on our streets, no place in the studios or the workplaces of powerful men, nor in the unhappy homes of people subject to limitations, nor even to the bedrooms of the otherwise fortunate and well-educated. Expressed at its simplest, perhaps at its most unrealistic, we should all find better things to do.